"You can't be out here," he said. "This is a restricted area. How did you get past the gate?" He said it the way you talk to a trespasser. The way you talk to someone who's lost, confused, wandering, someone who's ended up somewhere they obviously don't belong and needs to be put back where they came from. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The grip said everything the volume didn't. She looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at him. And she said the only thing she was going to say to him for a long, long time. "Let go." 2 words. That's all she gave him. Not an explanation, not a credential, not a threat or a justification or a plea, just the instruction. Let go. He didn't. His name was Garrett Sisk. He was 42. He had brown hair going thin at the crown, a golf tan, and the particular build of a man who'd been athletic in college and hadn't fully accepted that college was 20 years ago. He wore a white short-sleeve pilot's shirt with epaulettes, dark pants, aviator sunglasses pushed up on his forehead. He flew a Beechcraft King Air 350 for a charter company called Coastal Sky Aviation, based here at Beaufort County Regional Airport, a small field with 1 runway, a modest terminal building, and a ramp that held maybe 15 aircraft on a busy day. Garrett had been flying for 19 years. He held an airline transport pilot certificate, the highest pilot certificate the FAA issues. He'd logged over 9,000 hours. He was the chief pilot of Coastal Sky's Beaufort operation, which meant he was the senior aviator at this airport, which meant, in his understanding of the hierarchy, that this ramp was his jurisdiction, and anyone on it answered to him. He didn't let go because he hadn't decided to let go. In Garrett's mind, this was still his moment. He was still the authority. The woman he was holding, a black woman in her late 60s, small, gray-haired, wearing dark slacks and a light blue blouse and flat shoes and no badge, no lanyard, no vest, no visible reason to be standing on an active aircraft ramp in the July heat. This woman was a problem he was solving. He'd seen her from the cockpit window of the King Air. He was doing his pre-flight walk-around, checking control surfaces, when he noticed her walking across the ramp. She was moving slowly, methodically, looking at the aircraft, looking at the tie-down cables, looking at the pavement markings, looking at the fuel truck parked near the terminal. She was carrying a small leather notebook and a pen. She'd stop, write something, look up, write something else. She wasn't wearing a reflective vest. She wasn't wearing an airport badge. She was walking around a ramp full of aircraft and jet fuel and propellers and spinning things that could kill you, and she looked like somebody's grandmother who'd wandered through the wrong door. So Garrett walked over and grabbed her. That's the speed at which it happened. He saw, he assessed, he acted. No pause, no question, no "excuse me, can I help you?" or "ma'am, do you have authorization to be out here?" Nothing between the observation and the contact. The circuit was instantaneous. Wrong person, wrong place, remove. And now she was holding a fence post and telling him to let go, and he was still gripping her arm, and neither of them had moved, and the moment was suspended in the heat like a held breath. Her name was Muriel Gage. I need to tell you who she was, not because it justifies what happened to her. What happened to her was wrong before her title mattered, but because what she did next only makes sense if you understand the life behind it. Muriel Gage was 68 years old. She'd been born in Kinston, North Carolina, 40 miles from where she was standing right now. Her father had worked at the tobacco warehouse. Her mother had been a school cafeteria cook. They lived in a cinder-block house on a dirt road that didn't get paved until Muriel was in high school, and even then, only because her mother spent 3 years writing letters to the county commissioner until he got tired of reading them and sent a truck. Muriel learned 2 things from her mother. First, a letter is a weapon if you write enough of them. Second, nobody is going to pave your road for you. You have to make them uncomfortable enough to do it themselves. She'd gone to North Carolina A&T on a full academic scholarship, engineering. She was one of 4 women in the program and the only black woman. She graduated summa cum laude. She was recruited by NASA Langley Research Center, right there in Virginia, where she spent 6 years doing structural analysis on aircraft components, wind tunnels, stress testing, fatigue analysis, the invisible math that keeps wings attached to airplanes. In 1986, she left NASA and joined the Federal Aviation Administration. And she never left. 38 years. She'd started as an aviation safety inspector at the Flight Standards District Office in Raleigh, the FSDO, in FAA terminology. She inspected aircraft. She inspected operators. She inspected pilots. She reviewed maintenance records and operations manuals and training programs. And she did it with the particular thoroughness of a woman who understood that the difference between a safe airplane and an unsafe one was usually not a dramatic failure, but a quiet accumulation of small things that nobody noticed because nobody was looking. Muriel was always looking. She rose through the FAA the way she did everything, steadily, precisely, without fanfare. Inspector, senior inspector, branch manager, division director, regional director. And then, 11 years ago, she'd been appointed to a position that most people outside of aviation had never heard of, but that every pilot, every airline, every mechanic, and every aircraft manufacturer in the United States knew by heart. Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety. That was Muriel Gage's title, the Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety, the highest-ranking safety official in the Federal Aviation Administration. She oversaw flight standards, aircraft certification, aerospace medicine, air traffic safety, and the Office of Accident Investigation and Prevention. Every pilot certificate issued in the United States was issued under her authority. Every certificate action, every suspension, every revocation, every emergency order flowed through her office. When a pilot's certificate was revoked, the document that did it carried Muriel Gage's name. Not symbolically, literally. Her name was on the order. Her signature was on the line. She was the authority. And the scope of that authority was comprehensive. It covered every certificated pilot in the country, from a student pilot flying a Cessna 152 out of a grass strip in Iowa to an airline captain commanding a 777 across the Pacific, including the man who was currently gripping her arm on a ramp in Beaufort County, North Carolina. But Garrett Sisk didn't know any of this. He saw a woman without a badge. He saw a woman without a vest. He saw a black woman in her late 60s with a notebook, and his brain completed the circuit in under a second. And now his hand was on her arm and she was telling him to let go, and he was not letting go. "Ma'am, I don't know how you got out here, but you need to leave," Garrett said. "This is an active ramp. You could get hurt." The concern for her safety. That detail matters. He framed the grab as protection, as if he'd done her a favor, as if the danger on this ramp was propellers and jet blast, not the man who'd yanked a 68-year-old woman sideways hard enough to nearly put her on the concrete. "I am aware of where I am," Muriel said. Her voice was even, not flat, even. The voice of a woman who had learned, across 4 decades of entering spaces where her presence was questioned, that volume was surrender. Volume meant you'd lost control of the situation. Muriel had not lost control of anything. "You need a badge to be out here. Do you have a badge?" "I have identification." "Then where is it?" "It's in my bag." She nodded toward a leather messenger bag sitting on the ramp 20 feet away, near the nose of a Cessna 172. She'd set it down while she was taking notes. When Garrett grabbed her, she'd been 10 feet from the bag, walking back toward it. "Okay, well, you need to have it on you at all times. That's the rule. You can't just walk around without." "I know the rules," Muriel said. "I wrote several of them." He didn't hear that. Not really. The words entered his ears and his brain processed them as noise, the kind of thing people say when they're caught somewhere they shouldn't be and they're trying to bluff their way out. Everybody's got an excuse. Everybody's got a reason they don't need to follow the rules. Garrett had heard it before. He'd heard it from weekend pilots who skipped their checklists. He'd heard it from passengers who tried to walk onto the ramp to take photos. He'd heard it, and he'd developed a response that was firm and consistent, and in his own assessment completely fair. Get off the ramp. Ma'am, I need you to walk back through that gate. He pointed with his free hand toward the chain-link gate that separated the ramp from the public parking area. Right now. You need to let go of my arm first. I'll let go when you start walking. You'll let go now. Something in her voice changed. Not louder, denser. The words had weight. The voice of a woman who was giving an instruction, not making a request, and who understood the difference between the two the way an engineer understands the difference between compression and tension. Garrett felt it. You could see it in his face, a flicker, a moment of something that wasn't quite doubt but was adjacent to it. The faintest suggestion that the ground beneath him might not be as solid as he thought. But he didn't let go, because letting go would mean he'd been wrong. And Garrett Sisk did not like being wrong, not on his ramp, not in front of his airplane, not in the jurisdiction he'd claimed and defended for 6 years. Being wrong was expensive. It cost you authority, and authority once lost was hard to get back. So he held on. And that's when the second person appeared. Her name was Janelle Odom. She was 31. She was an aviation safety inspector, an ASI with the FAA's Flight Standards District Office in Raleigh. She'd been with the FAA for 5 years. She was sharp, meticulous, and still new enough to the job that every inspection felt like a test she was determined to pass. She was here because Muriel was here. Muriel had a practice that she'd maintained for all 11 years as associate administrator, of conducting unannounced field visits to airports across her jurisdiction. Not big airports, small ones, regionals, municipals, the places where oversight was thin and habits had room to drift. She'd show up with 1 or 2 staff members, no advance notice, no fanfare, and she'd walk the ramp, look at the aircraft, check the fuel facilities, review the operator's records. Not to catch people, to see. She'd done it 100 times. She'd found maintenance violations. She'd found fuel storage issues. She'd found aircraft operating without current inspections. She'd found everything, because the things that go wrong in aviation always live in the places nobody's looking, and Muriel made it her business to look. Today, she was visiting Beaufort County Regional because the FSDO in Raleigh had received 2 complaints in the past 6 months about Coastal Sky Aviation, the charter company Garrett Sisk flew for. The complaints were about maintenance. Specifically, about aircraft being operated with deferred maintenance items that should not have been deferred, squawks that were signed off without being fixed, logbook entries that didn't match the actual condition of the aircraft. Muriel had read the complaints. She'd asked the Raleigh FSDO to investigate, and they had, but the investigation had been slow, limited resources, competing priorities, the chronic understaffing that plagued every FSDO in the country. So Muriel had decided to look for herself. She'd driven down from Washington 5 hours because she liked driving, because the car gave her time to think, because flying into the airport she was inspecting would defeat the purpose of being unannounced. She'd arrived at the airport at 10:30. She'd parked in the public lot. She'd walked through the terminal, through the pilot lounge, through the FBO, the fixed base operator, the building that served as the gateway between the public side and the air side. She'd walked onto the ramp through the gate that separated the two. The gate was unlocked, unattended, no sign-in, no badge check, no camera. That was the first thing she'd written in her notebook. Janelle had been with her. They'd walked the ramp together for about 20 minutes, looking at aircraft, checking tie-downs, examining the fuel farm. Then Muriel had told Janelle to go inside and pull Coastal Sky's operations records from the FBO's files while Muriel continued on the ramp. Janelle had gone inside. She'd been in the FBO office for 8 minutes, reviewing logbooks, when she looked out the window and saw a man holding Muriel's arm. She was out the door in 4 seconds. Janelle crossed the ramp at a pace that was just short of running. She was wearing an FAA polo shirt, dark blue, with the FAA seal embroidered on the chest, and she was carrying her credential case in her left hand, open, badge and ID visible. She'd learned in 5 years of inspections that the badge went out before the words. People respond to the badge. The badge bought you 3 seconds of silence, and 3 seconds was enough to establish the frame. She reached Garrett and Muriel. She positioned herself at Muriel's side, not between them, beside Muriel. The geometry was deliberate. She was not inserting herself as a mediator. She was standing with the person who was being held. "Sir, I need you to release this woman immediately." Garrett looked at Janelle. He saw the polo shirt. He saw the badge. His grip loosened, not all the way, but enough that Muriel could feel the pressure change. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm Aviation Safety Inspector Janelle Odom, FAA Flight Standards District Office, Raleigh. You are currently physically restraining a person who is authorized to be on this ramp. Release her now." The badge did its work. Garrett's hand opened. He let go of Muriel's arm and took a half-step back, as if the badge had generated a physical force that pushed him. But his face didn't change. The expression was still the same, the defensive certainty of a man who believed he was right, and who was now being challenged by someone with a badge, which was annoying but didn't change the fundamental calculus. "She doesn't have a badge," Garrett said. "She doesn't have a vest. She was walking around the ramp with a notebook like she was sightseeing. I'm the chief pilot here. It's my job to—" "Sir," Janelle's voice was quiet, "do you know who this woman is?" "I don't care who she is. She doesn't have a badge." Janelle looked at Muriel. Muriel gave the smallest shake of her head. "Not now, not yet." Janelle understood. She'd worked with Muriel long enough to know that Muriel operated on a timeline that was invisible to everyone except Muriel. She didn't reveal information until the moment when revealing it would serve the purpose she'd chosen. And right now, on this ramp in this heat, with the red marks of Garrett's grip still visible on her arm, Muriel had chosen a different purpose. She wanted to see what he'd do next. Because what a person does next, after the badge appears, after the authority shifts, after the first crack appears in the wall of their certainty, tells you more about them than everything that came before. The before is reflex. The after is character. "I need to see your pilot certificate," Janelle said to Garrett. "My what?" "Your pilot certificate, and your medical certificate, and your photo ID. Standard ramp inspection protocol. You're a pilot on an active ramp in proximity to an aircraft you appear to be operating. I'm conducting an inspection." Now, this is where the story does something that you need to watch closely, because it's the fulcrum, the point where the weight shifts and everything after it moves in a different direction. Garrett Sisk had a choice. He could cooperate. He could produce his certificates, answer the inspector's questions, and proceed with his day. The ramp inspection was routine. Inspectors showed up at airports and asked pilots for their documents. It happened every day at every airport across the country. It was a normal, legal, unremarkable part of operating in the national airspace system. All he had to do was cooperate. But cooperating would mean accepting that the woman he'd grabbed was authorized. It would mean accepting that his judgment, his instinct, his certainty, his reading of the situation had been wrong, and accepting that was more than his pride could absorb in this moment, on this ramp, in front of this audience. Because there was an audience now. 2 line service technicians had come out of the FBO. They were standing near the fuel truck, watching. A student pilot and his instructor had paused near a Piper Cherokee on the far side of the ramp, looking over. The FBO's front desk attendant, a young woman named Kayla, was visible through the glass door of the building, hand on the phone, watching. Garrett was aware of the audience, and the audience changed his math, not in the direction of humility, in the direction of performance. Because backing down in front of people felt like losing, and Garrett Sisk did not lose on his ramp. I'm not showing you anything until she tells me why she was out here without a badge, he said. He pointed at Muriel. This is my ramp. I'm responsible for security. I did my job. Sir, I've identified myself as an FAA inspector, and I've requested your certificates. Under 14 CFR 61.3, you are required to present your pilot certificate, medical certificate, and photo identification upon request by an FAA inspector. This is not optional. Garrett stared at Janelle. His jaw worked. The muscles in his neck were tight. I want to talk to your supervisor, he said. Janelle didn't blink. She didn't look at Muriel. She didn't smile. She simply said, "You're looking at her." The silence lasted 5 seconds. That doesn't sound long. Count it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 seconds of Garrett Sisk looking at Janelle Odom, then looking at Muriel Gage, then looking back at Janelle, the arithmetic of the situation rearranging itself in real time behind his eyes. Muriel stepped forward. 1 step, just enough to close the distance between herself and Garrett from 6 feet to 4. My name is Muriel Gage, she said. I'm the Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety, Federal Aviation Administration. She said it the way she said everything, without emphasis, without drama, without the theatrical pause that someone else might have used to let the weight of the title land. She just said it. The way you'd say my name is Muriel and I'm an engineer, or my name is Muriel and I'm from Kinston. A fact, not a weapon, not yet. But the fact did what facts do when they're heavy enough. It restructured the space. Garrett's face went through a sequence I've described before in these stories, the rapid cascade of hearing, processing, recognizing, and recalibrating. But this time, the sequence had an extra stage. Because this time, the person delivering the information was someone he'd grabbed, someone he'd pulled sideways, someone whose arm still bore the red impressions of his fingers. The extra stage was fear. Not physical fear. The fear of a man who has just realized that the authority he claimed, the chief pilot authority, the "this is my ramp" authority, the "I'm in charge here" authority, is a pebble sitting next to a mountain. The fear of a man who understands, in a single cold rush, that the woman he put his hands on has the power to take away the thing he's built his entire identity around. His pilot certificate, his license, his career, his 9,000 hours, his 19 years. All of it lived on a piece of paper that existed at the pleasure of the Federal Aviation Administration. And the Federal Aviation Administration was standing 4 feet in front of him, rubbing the marks on her arm. That's, Garrett started. He stopped, started again. I didn't know. I know you didn't, Muriel said. I was just trying to. I know what you were trying to do. The ramp security. Mr. Sisk, she used his name. She'd read it from the placard on the King Air's cockpit window, the way she read everything, automatically, constantly, the habit of a woman who'd spent 38 years cataloging details that other people walked past. I've been on aircraft ramps since before you were born. I know what ramp security looks like. This wasn't ramp security. This was you deciding in approximately 3 seconds that I didn't belong here and putting your hands on me to remove me. Without asking who I was, without asking for my identification, without following any protocol that exists in any operations manual I've ever reviewed, and I've reviewed all of them. She said it without raising her voice. She said it in the same register she used for everything: briefings, testimony, phone calls, prayer. The register of a woman who had learned, at some point so early in her life that she couldn't remember the specific lesson, that calm was not the absence of power. It was the most efficient delivery system for it. Garrett opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He stood on the ramp in the July sun, his hand still half raised from where it had been on Muriel's arm, and he experienced something that he'd probably never experienced on this ramp before. He was completely, thoroughly, unanswerably wrong. And everyone was watching. Here is what Muriel did next, and I need you to notice the order, because the order tells you everything about who she was. She didn't berate him. She didn't threaten him. She didn't call Washington and initiate a certificate action on the spot, though she had the authority to do exactly that. An emergency revocation order, issued verbally, effective immediately, grounding Garrett Sisk before he could reach the cockpit of the King Air he'd been pre-flighting. She could have. Let me be clear about that. The Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety has the authority to issue emergency orders when she determines that a certificate holder poses a safety risk. And a pilot who physically grabs an unidentified person on a ramp, without verifying their identity, without following security protocols, using enough force to nearly cause a fall, is a pilot whose judgment is questionable. A pilot whose first response to an unfamiliar situation is physical force, rather than communication, is a pilot whose decision-making in a cockpit, where every second requires the precise calibration of authority and information, cannot be trusted. Muriel could have ended his career in 60 seconds. She didn't. Instead, she said, "Inspector Odom, please proceed with the ramp inspection." Janelle nodded, "Yes, ma'am." She turned to Garrett. "Sir, I still need to see your pilot certificate, medical certificate, and photo ID." Garrett reached into his back pocket, his wallet. His hands were trembling, that fine, adrenaline-driven tremor that doesn't show from a distance but is unmistakable up close. He extracted his certificates and his driver's license and handed them to Janelle. She examined them. ATP certificate current, first-class medical current, photo ID valid. She noted the certificate numbers in her notebook. "Thank you," she said. "Now I'd like to inspect the aircraft." She gestured toward the King Air. "Operations manual, weight and balance, maintenance records, current inspections." "They're in the cockpit," Garrett said. His voice had gone flat. The volume was there, but the force behind it had evaporated, the way a balloon empties when you pinch the neck, not a pop, just a slow, quiet deflation. "I'll need to see them." Garrett walked to the King Air. Janelle followed. They climbed the air stairs and disappeared into the aircraft. Muriel stayed on the ramp. She walked to her messenger bag, which was still sitting near the nose of the Cessna 172. She picked it up. She slung it over her shoulder. She opened her notebook and continued writing, the notes she'd been taking before she was grabbed. Fuel farm condition, tie-down integrity, ramp surface condition, the unlocked, unattended gate. She wrote without hurrying. She wrote with the pen she always carried, a black Pilot G2 fine point, the same pen she'd been using for 20 years. She wrote in her small, precise handwriting, every letter legible, every observation specific. She documented the gate. She documented the absence of security signage. She documented the lack of badge requirements for ramp access. She documented the fuel truck's positioning relative to the aircraft too close, by the standards she knew from memory, FAA Advisory Circular 155-2105D, paragraph 4.3. And then she documented what had happened to her. She wrote the time. She wrote the location on the ramp. She wrote Garrett's name. She wrote what he'd said. She wrote what he'd done, the grab, the pull, the near fall, the grip maintained after she told him to let go. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, as data, not as narrative, not as complaint, as data points in a larger pattern that she was building piece by piece, the way she'd been building patterns for 38 years. She flexed her left hand. The palm still stung from the hot fence post. The skin was red but not blistered. It would be fine. Her arm was a different matter. She pulled up the sleeve of her blouse and looked. 4 distinct marks, the prints of 4 fingers running in a curved line above her elbow. Not bruises yet. They would be by tomorrow. She'd seen enough bruises in her life to know the trajectory. Red now, purple by morning, yellow-green by Thursday. She took a photo with her phone, held her arm at the angle that showed the marks most clearly, took 3 photos, different angles, time-stamped. This was not anger. This was procedure. Muriel Gage had learned from her mother's letters to the county commissioner, from her years at NASA measuring stress fractures invisible to the naked eye, from her decades at the FAA documenting the small things that became big things when nobody was watching, that the most powerful response to injustice was not heat, it was a record. Heat could be dismissed. Heat could be reframed. Heat could be turned against you. She was emotional. She was irrational. She overreacted. A record couldn't be dismissed. A record sat in a file and waited. And when the time came, when the right question was asked by the right person in the right room, the record answered. Clearly, specifically, with timestamps and photographs and the unimpeachable precision of a woman who had spent her life measuring things that mattered. Janelle was inside the King Air for 22 minutes. When she came out, she was carrying a manila folder and her expression had changed. She walked across the ramp to Muriel with the particular stride of an inspector who has found something, not the hurried stride of alarm, but the measured stride of confirmation. The stride that says, the complaints were right. "Director Gage," she said. She used the formal title deliberately within earshot of the two line technicians and the student pilot who were still watching. "I've completed the initial document review on the King Air, tail number November 47 Bravo Charlie." "What did you find?" Janelle opened the folder. Inside were photocopies she'd made of the aircraft's maintenance logbook pages. The aircraft had a portable copier on board, which was unusual, and which Janelle had used without asking permission, because an FAA inspector conducting a ramp inspection doesn't need permission. 3 deferred maintenance items, Janelle said. An inoperative number 2 engine fire detection loop, a cracked windshield heat element, and a malfunctioning cabin pressurization bleed valve. She said each item with the careful enunciation of someone who understood that the words she was speaking weren't technical jargon. They were safety margins. They were the distances between an airplane that could protect its occupants and an airplane that couldn't. "The fire detection loop has been deferred for 6 weeks, Janelle continued. The MEL minimum equipment list allows a deferral for 10 days. It's been 6 weeks. Muriel said nothing. She waited. The windshield heat element was deferred 11 days ago. The MEL allows 3 days. Still nothing. And the pressurization bleed valve, that one was deferred yesterday. But the MEL doesn't permit deferral at all. It's a no-go item. This aircraft should not be flying with a malfunctioning pressurization bleed valve." Muriel looked at the King Air. It sat on the ramp in the sun, white with a blue stripe, engines quiet, stairs down. It looked the way all airplanes look when they're sitting still, elegant, capable, trustworthy. The kind of machine that makes you feel safe. But it wasn't safe. It was a machine with 3 open wounds that had been papered over with logbook entries and deferrals, and the signature of a mechanic who either didn't know the rules or didn't follow them. "Who signed off the deferrals?" Muriel asked. Janelle checked the logbook copies. The first 2 were signed by the company's director of maintenance, a Mr. Franklin Hobbs. The pressurization valve was signed off by Captain Garrett Sisk. Muriel looked up. The pilot signed a maintenance deferral. "Yes, ma'am. He signed it as pilot in command accepting the deferral." "A pilot doesn't have the authority to accept a no-go MEL item." "No, ma'am, he doesn't." Muriel closed her notebook. She put the pen in her pocket. She looked at the King Air one more time, then turned and looked at the FBO building, where Garrett Sisk was now visible through the glass doors, standing inside, talking on his phone. His body language was agitated, packing, gesturing, the posture of a man who was calling someone for help and not getting the answers he wanted. "Janelle," Muriel said. "Yes, ma'am." "Ground the aircraft." "Immediately." "Immediately. Issue a condition notice. November 47 Bravo Charlie is grounded until all 3 deferred items are corrected, inspected, and signed off by an appropriately rated mechanic. not the director of maintenance at this company, an independent mechanic. I don't trust the maintenance program at this operation. Yes, ma'am, I'll issue the notice now. Janelle walked toward the FBO to file the paperwork. Muriel stayed on the ramp. She stood in the heat and looked at the airplane and thought about the passengers who would have been on it. The King Air was configured for 8 passengers. Garrett had been pre-flighting it for a charter flight, probably a midday departure, probably business travelers, probably people who would have boarded that aircraft and buckled their seatbelts and closed their eyes and trusted that the machine was sound and the pilot was competent and the system was watching. The machine was not sound. The pilot had signed a maintenance deferral he didn't have the authority to sign. And the system that was supposed to be watching, had been slow, understaffed, underfunded. 2 complaints in 6 months and the investigation was still pending. If Muriel hadn't driven down here, if she hadn't walked this ramp, if she hadn't been standing next to this airplane when Garrett grabbed her arm. The bleed valve, a malfunctioning pressurization bleed valve in a King Air 350 at altitude. The scenarios ran through her mind the way they always did, because Muriel had spent 6 years at NASA analyzing structural failures and 38 years at the FAA investigating what happened when systems failed, and her imagination was not the kind that conjured happy endings. Her imagination was calibrated to consequences. Rapid decompression at flight level 280, 8 passengers and 2 crew, loss of pressurization, hypoxia within seconds, emergency descent required. If the crew responded correctly, masks on, descend immediately, survivable. If they didn't, if the crew was slow or confused, or if the captain was the kind of captain who overrode his first officer and said "I've got it" instead of following the checklist. She stopped the scenario. She didn't need to finish it. She'd read the accident reports. She'd read hundreds of them. She knew how the sentences ended. She picked up her bag and walked toward the FBO. Inside the FBO, Garrett was no longer on the phone. He was sitting in one of the lobby chairs, the cracked vinyl kind, the kind that sticks to your legs in the heat, and he was staring at the floor. The agitation was gone. In its place was something quieter, something that looked from across the room like the beginning of understanding. Muriel walked past him to the counter where Janelle was filing the grounding notice with Kayla, the front desk attendant. She didn't speak to Garrett, not yet. But Garrett spoke to her. "Ma'am." She stopped, she turned. He was looking at her now, really looking at her, not the way he'd looked at her on the ramp, when he'd seen a category instead of a person. Looking at her the way you look at someone when the category has dissolved and the person is all that's left. "I'm sorry," he said, "for putting my hands on you. That was wrong." She looked at him. She measured the words the way she measured everything, not by how they sounded, but by what they contained. She looked for the specific. She looked for the real. She looked for the difference between "I'm sorry I got caught" and "I'm sorry for what I did." "What specifically are you sorry for?" she asked. Not cruelly. The question was genuine. She wanted to know what he understood. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then, "I grabbed you without asking who you were. I assumed you didn't belong here. I used force when I could have used words. I didn't let go when you told me to." 4 things, each one specific. Each one an acknowledgement of a choice, not a mistake, not an accident, a choice. Muriel nodded. "Thank you for saying that. I didn't know you were." "That's not why it was wrong." The sentence stopped him. 5 words that dismantled the foundation he'd been building, the foundation of "if I'd known, I wouldn't have." Because that foundation was made of the wrong material. It was made of the idea that who she was determined whether she deserved to be treated with basic physical respect. And Muriel was telling him, quietly, precisely, that her identity wasn't the point. Her humanity was the point. And he'd failed at that level, the most fundamental level, before titles or badges or authority entered the equation. "No," he said, "it's not." He sat back in his chair. He looked at his hands, the hands that had gripped her arm, and he turned them over and looked at his palms, as if the evidence of what he'd done might be visible there, imprinted like an ink stain. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Muriel said, "Inspector Odom completes her inspection. We review the maintenance records for your entire fleet. We determine the scope of the violations. And you and I have a longer conversation, not here, not today, about everything that happened on this ramp. My certificate. Your certificate is a separate matter, and it's one I'll be addressing personally." She said it without emphasis, without satisfaction, without any trace of the retribution that another person might have felt, the righteous, justified, deeply human impulse to punish someone who'd hurt you. Muriel didn't operate on impulse. She operated on process. And the process had steps, and the steps had an order, and the order existed to ensure that the outcome was fair. Not lenient, not harsh. Fair. Fair meant following the evidence wherever it led. Fair meant treating Garrett Sisk the same way she'd treat any pilot who had physically accosted an inspector during an official visit, and who had signed maintenance deferrals outside his authority on an aircraft with 3 open safety discrepancies. Fair meant not making the punishment bigger because she was angry, and not making it smaller because he'd apologized. Fair was hard. Fair was the hardest thing. But Muriel had been doing hard things since Kinston, North Carolina, and she wasn't about to stop now. The inspection of coastal sky aviation took 3 days. Muriel stayed in Beaufort County. She booked a room at the Holiday Inn Express on the highway. She ate dinner at the Cracker Barrel next door, because the Cracker Barrel had sweet tea and biscuits and it reminded her of home, and because after a day on a ramp in July being grabbed by a pilot and grounding an airplane and reviewing maintenance records that made her stomach hurt, she needed biscuits. She called her sister, Delphine, that first night. "Hey, Del." "Hey, Mur, you in Carolina?" "Beaufort County." "That's close to home." 40 miles. "You going to Kinston?" "Maybe, if I have time." "Mama's house is still standing, you know. The Hendersons bought it. They painted it yellow." Mama would have hated yellow. Mama hated every color except green. That woman wanted the whole world green. Muriel smiled. It was the first real smile since the ramp. The kind of smile that happens when you're talking to the one person in the world who shares your specific memories, your specific losses, your specific version of a cinder block house on a dirt road that got paved because your mother wrote enough letters to annoy a county commissioner into action. "Something happened today," Muriel said. "What kind of something?" "A pilot grabbed me on a ramp." Silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, it's full. Full of Delphine processing, calculating, running through the scenarios the way she always did, because Delphine was a retired ER nurse and her brain sorted information by severity. "Are you hurt?" "Bruised my arm, it's nothing serious." "Did you fall?" "Almost." "Muriel." "I didn't fall, I caught myself." "Who was he?" "A charter pilot. He thought I was trespassing." "Because you were black." Muriel didn't answer immediately. Not because Delphine was wrong. Because Muriel had spent her career in a profession where precision mattered, where you didn't state a conclusion until the evidence supported it, and where the difference between "I believe" and "I can prove" was the difference between an opinion and an action. "Because I didn't look like what he expected," Muriel said. "Same thing." "It might be the same thing, but the investigation will determine what he was thinking. My job is to determine what he did." "Your job is also to be safe, Mur. You're 68. You can't be out on ramps by yourself getting grabbed by." "I've been on ramps by myself for 38 years." "And how many times have you been grabbed?" Muriel was quiet. "Muriel." "Twice." The word landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Twice. In 38 years of walking ramps, inspecting aircraft, doing the work that kept the aviation system safe, Twice someone had put their hands on her. Not because she was trespassing, not because she was doing anything wrong, because she was a black woman on a ramp and someone decided in the time it takes to blink that she didn't belong. The first time was in 1994, Muriel said. Wichita, a mechanic. He grabbed my wrist when I tried to look at a logbook, said I wasn't authorized. What happened to him? He was reprimanded. His company was fined. And this time is different. Because you're the associate administrator now. No, because this time, the pilot who grabbed me was flying an aircraft with 3 deferred maintenance items, one of which should have grounded the airplane. And he signed the deferral himself. He doesn't have that authority. He was putting passengers at risk. Delphine was quiet for a moment. So the man who grabbed you for being on the ramp was the one who shouldn't have been flying off it. Yes. Lord. I know. What are you going to do? My job. The 3-day inspection revealed the following. Coastal Sky Aviation operated 6 aircraft, 4 King Airs and 2 Cessna Citations. Of the 6, 4 had maintenance discrepancies that exceeded allowable deferral periods. 2 of those 4, including the King Air that Garrett had been pre-flighting, had no-go items that should have prevented flight. The company's director of maintenance, Franklin Hobbs, had been signing off deferrals without performing the required inspections. In some cases, he'd signed off repairs that were never done. The logbook said the work was complete, but the aircraft said otherwise. A broken fire detection loop that the logbook claimed was fixed 3 weeks ago was still broken. A cracked windshield heat element that was supposedly replaced was still cracked, with the same crack in the same position. Franklin Hobbs had been cutting corners, not because he was evil, because he was overwhelmed. He was one mechanic maintaining 6 aircraft for a charter company that flew 30 hours a week, and the owner of the company, a man named Dale Prescott, who was never at the airport and who ran the business from his house in Raleigh, had been reducing the maintenance budget for 3 consecutive years while increasing the flight schedule. Franklin was trying to keep 6 airplanes flying with the resources to keep 4 of them safe. The math didn't work. Something had to give. And what gave was the maintenance deferred, delayed, signed off on paper and ignored in practice, because the pressure to fly was greater than the pressure to fix. This is how accidents happen, not with a single dramatic failure, with a slow accumulation of pressures that push people to cut corners, and a system that doesn't catch the cuts until something breaks. Muriel caught the cuts. She caught them because she drove 5 hours from Washington to walk a ramp in eastern North Carolina. She caught them because she carried a notebook and a pen, and she looked at things that nobody else was looking at. She caught them because she'd spent 38 years training herself to see the invisible, the hairline fracture, the deferred squawk, the signature on a logbook that didn't match the condition of the machine. And she caught them because a pilot grabbed her arm, which brought an FAA inspector into a cockpit, which opened a maintenance logbook that had been closed too long. The grab didn't reveal the maintenance violations. The inspection did. But the grab was the catalyst, the event that put Muriel and Janelle in front of that specific aircraft at that specific time. Without the grab, they might have started with a different airplane. They might have started with the records. They might not have found the bleed valve for another hour, another day, another week. A week. That King Air was scheduled to fly a charter to Hilton Head on Thursday with 6 passengers, if the bleed valve had failed at altitude. Muriel didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. The thought finished itself. The FAA enforcement actions came in stages, because the FAA is a bureaucracy and bureaucracies move in stages, and Muriel, who had spent her career inside this particular bureaucracy, understood that the pace of justice was not the pace of a story. It was the pace of a system that had to be right, because being wrong meant either punishing someone who didn't deserve it or failing to punish someone who did, and both were unacceptable. Stage 1. Coastal Sky Aviation's Part 135 certificate was suspended. The company could not fly charter operations until a comprehensive maintenance review was completed, all discrepancies were corrected, and a new maintenance program was approved by the FSDO. Stage 2. Franklin Hobbs's airframe and power plant mechanic certificate was suspended pending an investigation into the fraudulent logbook entries. If the investigation confirmed that he had intentionally falsified records, which it did, 3 months later, the certificate would be revoked. He would never work as an aircraft mechanic again. Stage 3. Dale Prescott, the owner, was referred to the DOTS office of the Inspector General for investigation into whether his budget decisions constituted reckless disregard for safety. That investigation took 8 months. It resulted in a consent decree. Prescott agreed to divest his ownership of the charter company and was barred from holding any FAA certificate for 5 years. And Stage 4, Garrett Sisk. Garrett's case was separate from the maintenance case. Not because the two weren't connected, they were, through the deferral he'd signed, but because the FAA treated certificate actions individually and Garrett's certificate issues were his own. There were 2 issues. The first was the maintenance deferral. He'd signed a deferral for a no-go MEL item, the pressurization bleed valve, that he did not have the authority to defer. By signing it, he'd accepted responsibility for an aircraft he knew was unairworthy. That was a violation of 14 CFR 91.7. No person may operate an aircraft unless it is in airworthy condition. The second issue was the physical contact with an FAA inspector during an official inspection. This was not, strictly speaking, a certificate violation. The FAA didn't have a regulation that said thou shalt not grab inspectors, but the FAA did have a provision, 14 CFR 91.13, that covered careless or reckless operation. And the FAA's chief counsel, in consultation with Muriel's office, determined that a pilot who uses physical force on a ramp, in proximity to active aircraft, without provocation, demonstrates a disregard for safety and judgment that is relevant to his fitness to hold a certificate. The question was, what action was appropriate? Muriel recused herself from the specific determination. She had to. She was the person who'd been grabbed. She couldn't be the person who decided the penalty. That would be a conflict of interest, and Muriel Gage did not do conflicts of interest. She'd spent her career building a reputation for impartiality, and she wasn't going to compromise it, not for Garrett Sisk, not for anyone. The determination was made by the Regional Flight Standards Division Manager in consultation with the FAA's Office of the Chief Counsel. They reviewed the evidence. They reviewed Garrett's record. They reviewed the circumstances. Garrett had no prior violations. He had 9,000 hours. He had 19 years of clean flying. He had a letter of apology, not the vague, self-serving kind, but a specific, detailed letter acknowledging what he'd done and why it was wrong. He'd written it 3 days after the incident and sent it to Muriel's office without being asked. The letter said, in part, I grabbed a woman on a ramp because I decided in a fraction of a second that she didn't belong there. I didn't ask her. I didn't speak to her first. I put my hands on her. When she told me to let go, I didn't. I held on because I was certain I was right, and that certainty was more important to me than her safety, her dignity, and her right to be treated like a human being. I've spent the past 3 days asking myself what I was so certain about, and the answer I keep arriving at is not one I'm proud of. I was certain because of what she looked like. That's it. That's the whole truth of it. She was an older black woman without a badge, and I decided that was enough information to act on. It wasn't. It was never enough. And the fact that she turned out to be the highest-ranking safety official in the FAA doesn't change the analysis. If she'd been a janitor, what I did would have been just as wrong. I don't know if this letter matters. I don't know if anything I say can undo what I did. But I want it in the file because the file should contain the truth, and the truth is that I failed not as a pilot, but as a person. And I understand now that the two are not as separate as I once believed. Muriel read the letter. She read it twice. She put it in the file. The determination came down 6 weeks after the incident. Garrett Sisk's airline transport pilot certificate was revoked. Not suspended, revoked. The certificate was canceled. To fly again, he would need to retrain, retest, and reapply starting from the beginning. Private pilot, instrument rating, commercial, ATP, the entire progression, years of work, thousands of dollars, no guarantee of success. The revocation was based on 2 findings: the unauthorized maintenance deferral, operating an unairworthy aircraft, and the careless conduct on the ramp, demonstrating judgment incompatible with the privileges of a certificate holder. Garrett received the order by certified mail. He read it at his kitchen table in his apartment in New Bern. He set it down. He sat for a long time. He didn't appeal. He could have. The NTSB hears appeals of FAA certificate actions, and many pilots appeal and some win. Garrett's attorney told him he had a reasonable chance. The physical contact finding was unusual, and the maintenance deferral, while serious, was a first offense. But Garrett didn't appeal. When his attorney asked why, Garrett said, "Because the order is right." 3 words. And whether they were the words of genuine accountability or the words of a man who knew the evidence was against him, whether they came from growth or from calculation, is something only Garrett Sisk knows. But he said them, and he didn't appeal, and the revocation stood. The ripple effects moved outward the way they always do, not as a single wave but as a series of concentric circles, each one touching something the one before it didn't reach. The Raleigh FSDO, which had been slow to investigate the original complaints about coastal sky, was reviewed by the regional office. The review found systemic understaffing, not negligence, not incompetence, but a workload that exceeded capacity. The FSDO had 32 inspectors covering a geographic area that should have had 45. The complaints about coastal sky had been assigned, triaged, and placed in a queue behind 12 other open investigations, 3 of which involved larger operators with more aircraft and more passengers. Muriel took this finding to Congress, not as a press conference, not as a scandal, as testimony. She appeared before the House Transportation Committee and described in her precise, unhurried way the gap between the FAA's inspection mandate and its inspection resources. She described Beaufort County Regional Airport. She described the unlocked gate. She described the 6 aircraft with 4 sets of maintenance problems. She described what could have happened if nobody had looked. She did not describe being grabbed. That wasn't the point. The point was the system, not the insult. The insult was personal. The system was everyone's. The committee authorized a supplemental appropriation for FAA flight standards staffing. It was modest, enough for 60 additional inspectors nationwide. Not enough to close the gap entirely, but enough to shorten the queue. Enough to make it more likely that the next complaint would be investigated in weeks instead of months. Enough to put more eyes on more ramps at more airports where the gate was unlocked and the logbooks were wrong. 60 inspectors, because a woman walked a ramp with a notebook. Janelle Odom was promoted. Not immediately. The FAA doesn't do immediately, but within the year. She was moved from field inspector to the FSDO's surveillance planning team, where she designed a new protocol for unannounced ramp inspections at Part 135 charter operations. The protocol prioritized operators who had received complaints and who hadn't been visited in more than 12 months. She called it the Beaufort Protocol internally. Nobody outside the office would ever hear that name, but inside the FSDO, everyone knew what it meant, and everyone knew where it came from. Janelle kept a copy of the inspection report from Beaufort County in her desk drawer. Not the maintenance findings, those were in the official file. She kept a copy of the page where she'd written her own notes during the inspection. At the top of the page, in her handwriting, was a sentence she'd written while standing on the ramp, watching Muriel take photos of the marks on her arm. She didn't stop working. That was what Janelle remembered most. Not the confrontation with Garrett, not the grounding of the aircraft, not the discovery of the maintenance violations. She remembered that after being grabbed, after nearly falling, after standing in the sun with finger marks darkening on her arm, Muriel Gage had picked up her notebook and continued the inspection. She didn't stop working. She didn't go inside. She didn't sit down. She didn't take a moment to process or recover or feel sorry for herself. She picked up the pen and continued writing, because the work was the work, and the work didn't stop because someone put their hands on you, and the fuel truck was still too close to the aircraft, and the gate was still unlocked, and there were still 6 airplanes to inspect, and the passengers who would board those airplanes deserved to be safe regardless of what had just happened to the woman who was trying to keep them safe. She didn't stop working. Janelle carried that sentence with her for the rest of her career. 8 months after the incident, Muriel drove to Kinston, 40 miles from Beaufort County, the town where she'd grown up. The cinderblock house on the dirt road, paved now, paved for 40 years, paved because her mother had written letters until the commissioner surrendered. The Hendersons had painted it yellow. Delphine was right. Their mother would have hated it. Muriel parked on the street and looked at the house for a while. She didn't get out of the car. She didn't need to. The house was just a house. The thing she'd come to see wasn't in the house. It was in the road. The paved road. The road that had been dirt for the first 15 years of her life. The road that had been paved because a woman who cooked cafeteria lunches had decided that her children deserved a road that didn't turn to mud every time it rained, and had written letters, handwritten, in blue ink, on lined paper from the dollar store, until the system responded. Her mother hadn't had a title. She hadn't had authority. She hadn't had a badge or a credential or the ability to freeze an airplane with a phone call. She'd had a pen and paper and the conviction that the road should be paved and the patience to keep writing until it was. Muriel looked at the road. She thought about her mother's letters. She thought about her own notebooks, the Pilot G2 pen, the small handwriting, the observations that nobody asked for but that everyone needed. She thought about Garrett Sisk's hand on her arm. She thought about the bleed valve on the King Air and the 8 passengers who would have been on it Thursday. She thought about the 60 new inspectors and the Beaufort Protocol and the queue at the Raleigh FSDO that was a little shorter now, a little faster, a little more likely to catch the next problem before the next problem caught someone else. She started the car. She drove back to Washington. She had work to do. She always had work to do. I want to leave you with something, and it's not a lesson. It's a question. How long does it take to decide someone doesn't belong? Garrett Sisk did it in 3 seconds. He saw Muriel on the ramp, saw her age, her skin, her clothes, the absence of a badge, and in 3 seconds the decision was made. Not consciously, not deliberately. 3 seconds of a circuit running so fast and so deep that it felt like instinct, like certainty, like a fact about the world rather than a choice about a person. 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds he missed everything. He missed the engineer who'd analyzed stress fractures at NASA. He missed the inspector who'd walked 1,000 ramps. He missed the woman who'd risen through an agency of 45,000 people to its highest safety position. He missed 38 years of knowledge and judgment, and the kind of expertise that can look at an airplane from 50 feet away and know something's wrong. He missed all of it in 3 seconds. And the thing that should sit with you, the thing I can't stop thinking about, is that those 3 seconds didn't just produce an insult. They almost produced a catastrophe. Because if Garrett Sisk hadn't grabbed Muriel Gage, she might not have been standing next to that specific King Air. And Janelle might not have inspected that specific cockpit, and nobody might have found the bleed valve until it was 28,000 feet too late. The grab led to the inspection. The inspection led to the grounding. The grounding led to the fix. The fix saved the passengers who would have been on that airplane. The man who grabbed her was the pilot who shouldn't have been flying. The woman he dismissed was the one who kept everyone safe. Think about that. Think about how close those two realities sat next to each other on that ramp in the July heat. The danger and the safety, the dismissal and the expertise, the hand that grabbed and the hand that wrote it all down. And now think about this. Somewhere right now, a woman with a notebook is walking through a space where she's not expected. She's looking at things nobody else is looking at. She's noticing details that other people walk past. She doesn't have a badge visible. She doesn't have the outfit. She doesn't match whatever picture is in the head of the person who's about to see her and decide in 3 seconds that she doesn't belong. And she's the only reason the system works. She's the one checking the logbook. She's the one measuring the fracture. She's the one who drove 5 hours because the complaint was 6 months old and nobody had looked yet, and somebody needed to look. She's out there right now, with her pen and her notebook, and the knowledge that nobody's going to thank her and somebody might grab her, and the work has to get done anyway. She hasn't stopped working. She's not going to.